Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, hit the notification bell, and check out my locals for more information on any new future programs and to support the channel. I'm joined by Terminal Philosophy to continue our series on the Second Punic War. This is part 3, which will cover the years 211 to 206, with a special focus on Scipio in Spain and Hasdrubal at Metaurus. So, as we left off in Spain, the Scipio brothers had died. Claudius Nero had consolidated the Roman position in what is today Catalonia and Aragon, and there had been kind of a standoff. Scipio Africanus was, I think at the time, the youngest proconsul to be appointed, and he took the command in Spain. In part, it was given to him because no one else wanted it, and even though it was a sort of a breach of protocol to have a man so young in command, it's like, well, nobody else wants the job, and the war is being lost all across the board. So what's important to say about Scipio Africanus is that he's largely unknown. Most people know who Hannibal is, Hannibal over the Alps, and they know if the Hannibal did get defeated, but they always seem to forget who defeated Hannibal. And I think as we'll see with this lecture and then the next one on the end of the Second Punic War, Scipio is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, commander of antiquity, because what he shows is a mastery of the art of war seldom seen, not only in antiquity, but throughout history, with regards to tactics, operations, strategy, and diplomacy. And just to give a brief breakdown, tactics is the application of troops on the battlefield to achieve a strategic victory, a tactical victory. His masterpieces at Ilipa. Operations is an overall campaign, which we could say is a Spanish campaign. And strategy is the overall course of beating an enemy at war. So in this case, beating the Carthaginians, correctly identifying Spain as their crucial benchmark of power, the market power base. And also diplomacy, where he's able to develop alliances with the Celtiberians, and as we'll see in the next lecture, with the Numidians in North Africa to achieve tactical supremacy over the Carthaginians. So he learns from his defeat of his uncle and father at the upper Beatus River. One of the reasons that probably induced them to make such a bold move was that was where the silver and gold mines were of the Carthaginian state. And if that could have been destroyed or captured, it would have essentially decapitated the Carthaginian economy in a war effort. The problem being they were not up to the task and committed the cardinal sin of dividing their army in two rather than maintaining unity and defeating each Carthaginian army in turn. And so the defeat of his uncle and father constantly looming over his head. So Scipio, seeing the strategic position of Rome and with naval supremacy, conceives of the bold plan of taking Carthaginian power base in Spain head on by capturing New Carthage. New Carthage was the administrative and logistical hub of the Carthaginian state. It had the best port in Spain and was considered, if not impregnable, a very difficult city to take, which, if the Romans had besieged it, would give them more than enough time to see that they were coming and then send a relief force. And Scipio knew that time was of the essence. So he, with his 27,500 strong man army, decided to deliver this coup de main. And one of the things that he did was he used scouts to talk to local fishermen in the region and figured out that there was a lagoon that at low tide was traversable to get to the walls of New Carthage. And so what he did was, New Carthage is situated on a peninsula within this inlet in Spain, so that, if you will, in front of it is access to the sea. It's connected to the mainland by this small isthmus, and then behind it is a lagoon. And so what he did was he had Roman troops attack along the isthmus, and he had a Roman naval assault force along the walls in order to distract the Carthaginians. And at the appointed time of low tide, had 5,000 picked men with scaling ladders march up the wall on the part of the city that was considered impassable and therefore poorly defended. So within a short amount of time, the city was taken. At that time as well, a naval assault force achieved success as well. And so the city was taken far quicker than anybody could have foreseen, in large part because the Carthaginians didn't believe that the lagoon could be taken. And so Scipio, at one blow, completely changes the whole situation in Spain. The Carthaginian forces are without a head. There's three basic armies. There's Hasdrubal, there's Gisco, and there's Mago scattered throughout Spain. And Scipio, not wanting to repeat the errors of his father and uncle, keeps his army together in order to defeat all of them one at a time. And Hasdrubal is only like 10 days march away from New Carthage, so he has to take the city quickly. And so that's in 209. And so the next year, he then tries to destroy Hasdrubal Barca's army. And he's fighting them at the lower Beatus, lower Beatus River, and at the plateau of Bucella. So Hasdrubal Barca's not attacking New Carthage. He realizes that he has to relieve his brother Hannibal. He's concerned about the loyalty of the Gallic tribes who have repeatedly switched sides, first against him at Tortosa, and then against the Romans at the Upper Beatus in 211. So he's like, well, they're not reliable. They can go either way. I'll give battle to Scipio to see who this new Roman general is. Is he like his father? Can I beat him? And if not, I'm going to go support Hannibal. So it's kind of like a reconnaissance in force where he's testing the strength. So he fortifies himself on a strong position, not expecting the bold strike that Scipio has planned. He has a thin guard of skirmishers. And Scipio sends up his Velites to initiate the combat to sort of contain and provoke a fight with Hasdrubal and get him to be distracted as he marches his main force up either flank of the slope of this hill. And the Carthaginians are not defending it because they're in their camp. And rather than standing and fighting in a losing battle, which he knows he is losing at this point, Hasdrubal escapes. Now, at this point, we can say that on the one hand, Scipio wins the battle because he's left in control of the battle space. But in another sense, it's only a marginal victory because Hasdrubal's army escapes. And the main thing that Scipio wanted to achieve was to prevent a juncture between Hasdrubal and Hannibal. He failed to do. As we'll get to later on in this program, that was later effected at Metaurus a year later. So in one sense, he failed to achieve his objective, but nonetheless, one Carthaginian army was removed from Spain. And so at this point, we can see that the battle for Spain is still up in the air. Scipio has consolidated his control of New Carthage, has facilitated the withdrawal of Hasdrubal, but Mago and Gisco and reinforcing troops led by Hanno are producing a large army to the south near Cadiz. So the great struggle for Spain is still open. But before we get to the final chapter in the Spanish campaign, do you have any thoughts, Terminal Philosophy?
No, that's a great summary. I would just say that, with the loss of Cartagena or New Carthage and Hasdrubal's army sent in retreat, that is, it's still not quite clear to the Romans at this point that they're starting to slowly gain the initiative in Spain. But I think the only thing I'll say about these comments on the Italian campaign is that I think the Romans are starting to understand that the overall Iberian Peninsula is basically, this power base of the Carthaginians with gold and silver that they had mined there for years. And so, however, the problem for the Romans is that Hasdrubal is headed in the direction of his brother in Italy. And, and we'll see later on, as, speculated by Livy, that this was, a bad thing to have happened. And of course, I think the only other notable person in the Battle of New Carthage, or the loss of New Carthage, is the loss of Mago, who becomes a prisoner of war. Other than that, the population is massacred. Something like 2,000 artisans were enslaved. They lost hundreds of artillery pieces, and something like 20 to 25 ships were captured. So, yeah, a big material loss for Carthage there.
Now, at this point, we see that with reinforcements from Hanno, Gisco and Mago assemble a massive army of 70,000 foot, 40,000 horse, and 32 elephants, of which Scipio can muster about 48,000 men. Now, as a precursor to the Battle at Ilipa, Scipio carefully courts the Celtiberian tribes in order to buttress his army. So there's one key instance where there's he captures a Celtiberian princess, and instead of dispersing her amongst the troops as war booty, he returns her to her betrothed, who's a chieftain of one of these tribes, earning the loyalty of these tribes in the war against Carthage. And also the The two chieftains that betrayed his father, he courts them as well. Obviously, he needs the Celtiberians on his side, at least for the time being. And so through his careful diplomacy, he's able to fill out his army with Celtiberian troops, because he knows there's no more troops coming from Roman Italy, because Hannibal's there, and Hasdrubal will shortly be there. Well, Hasdrubal's already been defeated at this point, but Rome is not in any position to send troops to help Scipio. And so he realizes that at the Battle of Aleppo, we see that the student has finally learned from the master. The student, the Romans, have finally learned and mastered from Hannibal. So what Scipio does is there's this twofold stratagem. The first thing that he does is he demonstrates for I think it's about a week. And demonstration is a specific military term where you marshal your troops, you put them in battle order, you blow the trumpets, you have your skirmishers go out there and bang their shields and throw their javelins, and more or less it's almost like a parade maneuver. It's not a fight itself. It's sort of a preliminary to a fight, and sometimes it never gets beyond that. It's a way for the army to sort of gauge each other's strength. So he creates this routine that lulls Gisco into a false sense of security. He musters his troops in the afternoon. He has his cavalry on the wings. In the center, he has his legions. And on either flank are his Iberian troops, the less reliable troops. Whereas the Carthaginians place their African corps in the center, their Iberian troops on the flanks, and then their cavalry further to the flanks, and then the elephants up front. But then after about a week of this, Scipio flips the script. He has his men wake up at daybreak, eat a breakfast, reshuffles his troop formations where the center is the unreliable Gauls, and the flanks are now the legions. Now, the Carthaginians, he then launches his velites and skirmishers forward to begin fighting with the Carthaginians. And this does two things. It wakes them up so that they can't actually have breakfast and throws them into confusion. And second of all, it screens his maneuvers. So Gisco doesn't know yet that the Roman formations have shifted. Scipio also uses the refused center strategy, where the center is intentionally held back, possibly remembering how unreliable these guys are. The Celtiberians betrayed both Hasdrubal and his father and uncle. So, you need them technically in the army, but you don't want them at the decisive moment because they might switch sides or run away. So he has them in a refused center position. He then sends the velites to the flanks to support the cavalry to help roll up the Carthaginian cavalry. Now, this is important because the Carthaginians are still using Numidians. And this is the first time where the Romans are able to decisively defeat Numidians on their own terms, which is, unheard of at this point in the war. And so then, as those flanks are getting rolled up, the Spanish troops are no match. The Carthaginian Spanish troops are no match for the Roman legionaries, who then begin to break through in the mathematics of attrition. And the African troops, who are the best troops of Gisco, don't actually see combat until they're completely surrounded, and their complete annihilation and decimation is only averted by a thunderstorm, which prevents the Romans from pursuit. But at this point, the Carthaginian forces are completely annihilated. Spain is more or less a foregone conclusion. The only thing Scipio has left is a mopping up operation. There's a revolt of about 8,000 troops that occurs later on in Sucro, and he can't kill them all because he actually needs them in the war for Africa. So what they protest is pays in arrears, and they have terrible health conditions in the swampy cities they've been deployed to, like New Carthage. And so he knows that he can't fight them because they outnumber his troops at this point, which is only 7,000. And so he sends false messages that he's going to punish the Celtic tribes who have defected yet again, this time to the mutineers. And so the mutineers are like, oh, that's great. And there's 35 ringleaders in the mutineer group and 7 loyal tribunes. And through secret commerce with the 7 tribunes, he develops a plan. He's got open negotiations with these rebels, but secretly plan to capture the 35 ringleaders. Everybody's put at ease when they believe that Scipio's forces are marching to fight the rebellious Celtiberians. And they also believe that he's sick, even sick to the point of death. which is also what precipitated the mutiny. But he marches his troops there double quick. He orders the 7 loyal tribunes to wine and dine the 35 ringleaders to get them drunk and then arrest them. And then when he arrives with his troops to the assembled mutineers on the pretense of negotiating with them, he then shows them the ringleaders, humiliates the ringleaders, and then executes them. And then the mutineers are terrified of this and swear a new oath of loyalty to Rome, never to take up arms again. But he just can't kill all these guys. He needs them for the upcoming African campaign. And then there's a small remnant of Carthaginian forces led by Mago, which are at the eastern coast of Spain. And so what ends up happening there is there's a naval battle at the mouth of the Cateria River, and then there's also a land battle on a small hillock at the mouth of that river. And the Roman forces at sea and on land destroy the last remnants of Carthaginian resistance. Mago picks up these survivors and sails to Cadiz, which refuses entrance to him. And at that point, there is really no effective resistance to Roman rule in Spain.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, the losses at Ilipa are fairly insane. I mean, for one, there's some disagreement between Polybius and Livy, which Livy says there's, the strength of the Carthaginians is around 55,000. Polybius says there are 74,000. With an unknown number of elephants under Livy, and Polybius says there was 32 elephants. So either way, Ilipa is basically the Stalingrad moment in southern Spain for the Carthaginians, in the sense that they have completely lost the offensive initiative. And not only that, but the Romans did a very good job on the sort of the non-battlefield side of things, the politicking side of things, of bringing people under their political influence via subterfuge. And it's basically just a complete loss of territory and influence by the Carthaginians in southern Spain. Now, Hasdrubal Gisco and Mago Barca, presumably, they still had, as you mentioned, they still had a small surviving forces after the battle. But basically, since the Romans had created, reforged all these alliances basically by force or by threat or by subterfuge, they had also, denied the Carthaginians any future opportunity to create alliances with these various tribes in Iberia. So at this point, Scipio Africanus can then start drawing his plans for, amphibious invasions of Carthage in North Africa at this point. But other than that, I think you thoroughly covered the Ilipa as far as the formations go. And there just wasn't, the Carthaginians unfortunately just lacked a strong center in this case. There wasn't, you don't see like these Alexander the Great type of, flanking maneuvers with hammer and anvil tactics or anything like that. It's more of just, unfortunately, just employing a weak center that forced the Carthaginians into retreat.
Yeah, so the last thing I'll say to wrap up as an overview of Scipio's campaign is what Scipio shows is a level of bold, direct action that Hannibal showed when he crossed the Alps. So the Roman Alps moment was taking New Carthage. And it's again something that we'll see again and again with Scipio. He takes these bold, direct actions. He's able to identify the weak point of a Carthaginian position and then strike quickly with his full force. And time again, it just throws the Carthaginians into confusion. Rome had finally found its own Hannibal. Now, in Italy, things are going poorly, very poorly. At the Second Battle of Hardonia in 211, or 210 rather, we see that there are 2 Roman consuls, Marcus Claudius Marcellus and Gnaeus Fulvius Centumalus, at the head of 4 legions. Now, their turn, they commit the same cardinal error as the 2 Scipio brothers. They divide the army in 2. Marcellus marches to capture Stalapia, which he does through a subterfuge and intrigue. And Hannibal spreads rumors that he's marching to Bruttium. And so Marcellus then follows him into Samnium. Now, Hannibal then catches Centumalus in Apulia, and throwing all of his forces in an encircling maneuver, the Numidians strip the Romans of their cavalry protection and then encircle and destroy the Roman force. Anywhere from 7,000 to 13,000 men were killed. This was brutal. So shortly thereafter, Marcellus seeks to avenge the Roman defeat at Numistro, which is an inconclusive battle, but seems to get Hannibal to disengage. And then in 209, at the Battle of Canusium, we see again Marcellus fights Hannibal, and this time he suffers heavy losses. The account given in the life of Marcellus by Plutarch is somewhat, not confused, but sparse. But apparently he was using green levy legions as well as his veteran legions, and Hannibal was placing pressure on the levies. And as they were breaking, he redeployed his veteran troops, but for whatever reason, the maneuver was bungled and threw the entire army into confusion, which led to another severe mauling by Hannibal. And at this point, the Roman Senate is considering recalling Marcellus for losing 2 battles to Hannibal in a row. So the Romans are still getting pounded in southern Italy as late as 209. Fabius Maximus takes Tarentum by treachery in 209, undermining Hannibal's position further. At Petelia, an ambush is set where a Roman portion of the garrison from Tarentum is sent to relieve the siege of Locri by the 2 consuls Marcellus and Crispinus, about 5,000 men total, 3,000 foot, 2,000 horse. Hannibal ambushes them near the city of Patella from a hill position, and they didn't do proper reconnaissance. Again, that seems to be Rome's MO. Don't recon, just walk right into Hannibal's traps, and they get annihilated. One wonders if this was also part of a broader plan to bait Marcellus, because later on at the Battle of Venusia, where Marcellus meets his death, in order to avenge the defeat at Patella, he marches to fight Hannibal. Now, Hannibal intentionally leaves a tactically important hill untaken. And he knows that the Romans, once they scout it out, will be tempted to occupy it to gain an important position over his own camp. And he has his javelin men and spearmen, so presumably Italian and Greek forces, and then the African infantry that he brought over from 218, hiding behind the hills. So when Marcellus, with 225 of his men, 45 are loyal, let's see, where were they? Faragliae, and then the remainder were Etruscans of dubious loyalty. When the ambush is sprung, the Etruscans run, leaving him with only 45 men. And he's run through in a spear by one of the Phoenician heavy infantry formations. So we see that one of Rome's greatest generals at the time, who was the first general to achieve an undisputed victory over Hannibal at Nola, was killed. So we see again that the Italian campaign is not going well. Since 212, Hannibal's probably killed another 50,000 Romans. In a period of 4 years. These numbers begin to boggle the mind. You wonder how the Romans can lose so many men, and they just keep coming. And now this is where the decisive element occurs. So prior to Hasdrubal's march over the Alps into Italy, there was a brief battle where Nero Claudius at the Battle of Grommutian gets the better of Hannibal by a surprise forced march, which mauls his army and puts him on the back foot in order to put Hannibal in a more defensive, cautious position. Now, Hasdrubal marches through over the Alps, this time without having to fight any of the Celts. The Celtic tribes at this point are like, oh, well, guess what? Hannibal has made a lot of gains in Italy. We have the possibility of making all this loot and plunder, and it's going to be great for us. So they just volunteer for his army. His army just swells marching over the Alps. And when he gets into Cisalpine Gaul, the Romans are like, oh, another general, another son of Hamilcar has come over. And what he does is he, according to Cressy, and I think Cressy's right in this, he commits 3 errors. His first error was to besiege Placentia, which the primary goal here was to link up with Hannibal. That should have been the primary goal that Hasdrubal did, but instead he wasted time besieging a relatively inconsequential city, a city that Hannibal himself bypassed in his original march into Italy. Now, this merely delayed the Roman forces. And so before we get to Metaurus, do you have anything to say about the Italian campaign up to this point?
Yes. Well, you're definitely right to mention that, even as late as 209 BC, Rome was just still getting its butt kicked in southern Italy. However, this era of the war is interesting in that it represents the turning point for the Romans, even though the Roman the Roman Senate it wasn't clear to them probably until about 205 that they had, completely captured the offensive initiative. I think it's important for people to understand that, the general dilemma for Hannibal after Cannae is that after he had successfully campaigned to the southern portion of Italy, he found himself both defending his new allies who had defected from Rome and also simultaneously trying to find a way to take offensive initiative from Rome itself. So, which he previously had. Now, even despite the victories at the Battle of Salaris in the northwest Lasania, and as well as the Battle of Herdonia, Hannibal was he was unable to break the siege of Capua. And I know we talked about this already, which, was his strongest ally in Italy. But after it was clear that there was no relief coming from Hannibal was coming, Capua, basically just the political situation there imploded. The 27 senators of Capua had sort of wined and dined in excess before poisoning themselves. However, as you mentioned before the stream, there was a lot of speculation by Livy that had Hasdrubal and his brother Hannibal sort of linked up in Italy to sort of reassert their strategic situation, or their operational situation, is probably a more accurate way of putting it. That would have probably spelled disaster for the Romans. Just one thing to keep in mind, sort of in a retrospective, is that by 210, it's either by 210 or 209, according to Osprey Publishing, written by Nigel Bagnall, there were 20 Roman legions that had been fielded in the Second Punic War. And of the 20 of them, 16 were in Italy. So that ought to tell you that Rome's first concern was, the protection of Rome, the city itself, but also to reestablish its power on the Italian peninsula, because that had been completely screwed up by Hannibal, especially a lot of his allies, like I think it's Tarentum and I forget, and obviously Capua, but other cities, as well as Syracuse with the young leader, after replacing his dead grandfather, had started reaching out to Hannibal. So there was all sorts, there was these signs on the wall that a lot of these so-called strong alliances that Rome had forged, they were basically starting to fall apart. However, as far as this lead into the Battle of Metaurus is concerned, as you had mentioned just briefly, Hasdrubal had crossed the Alps without really any major incident. For Hannibal, it was this sort of Herculean effort to simply cross the Alps due to weather, and then, also facing ambush from various Gallic tribes. However, Hasdrubal didn't have that same issue. Now, in Hasdrubal's search for his brother Hannibal, he sent out 6 horsemen. Unfortunately, they had the sort of battle plans with them, with their location of Hasdrubal's army. And some of these horsemen went as far south as far south into Italy, but never being able to find Hannibal. And so in these long routes that these horsemen had taken, these messengers, they were picked up by Rome, and Rome had discovered the location of Hasdrubal's army. And they basically marched, I think it was 2 or 3 legions that had marched north in order to capture Hasdrubal's army, and they had caught him up against the river of the Metauro River in Italy. And well, I don't know how deep you want me to get into the summary of this battle, but basically, unfortunately for Hasdrubal, he was basically surrounded, and sort of seeing that the battle was lost and the battle was a bit of a disaster, up against a river as well as steep terrain on the southern side of the river, Hasdrubal threw himself into the fray and ended up being killed. And as a result of this, Hasdrubal's severed head was thrown into one of the Punic outposts, somewhat nearby the battlefield. And 2 slaves have been released to be, to basically tell the tale of what had happened. And as you mentioned before, this is kind of one of those tragic moments in history that probably should have been captured by at least 1 or 2 Renaissance or classical paintings, or, and I won't even get to how frustrated I am that there's not some sort of, Hollywood production on the Second Punic War. But Unfortunately, Hannibal loses his brother Hasdrubal because, like you said earlier as well, Hasdrubal and Hannibal were able to deliver the goods. Hanno the Great back in Carthage, well, he's, and I'm using your words here, but he's basically the original boomer in that he failed upwards. Even basically losing to the mercenaries before the war had even begun, he still retained a position of power in Carthage. So this is also another horrible blow to the Carthaginians in Spain, because Hasdrubal's army is annihilated. Hasdrubal himself is killed, and it leaves Hannibal with this dilemma of figuring out a way to protect his newly found allies in his southern Italian base, doing this without the help of his brother, doing it with, this having one hand tied behind his back at home, politically speaking, because, the merchant class that's represented by Hanno the Great is basically just making life difficult for Hannibal logistically and in terms of, paying his mercenaries and so on. The concern of the merchant base is more based in Spain, where things obviously have gone horribly wrong as well. So that's sort of basically a lead into Metaurus and a very rough and tumble summary of it. But unfortunately, Hasdrubal is killed, as well as with about 10,000 of his men.
Right. So I feel like that it's worth quoting at length here Livy to describe the Romans' thought at Hasdrubal crossing the Alps. At Rome, there was no less panic and confusion than there had been 4 years before, when a Carthaginian camp had been pitched before the Roman walls and gates. Nor was it clear to men's minds whether they should praise or blame so bold a march on the part of the consul, this consul being Nero. It was plain that it would be praised or blamed according to the outcome, than which nothing is more unjust. They said that the camp had been left near an enemy who was Hannibal without a general, with an army which had been detached of all its strength, all its flower. The consul had indeed indicated a march into Lucania, whereas he was heading for Pecunium in Gaul, leaving a camp that was defended by nothing more than the deception of the enemy, who was unaware that the general and part of his army were not there. What was to happen if that became known, and Hannibal should wish either with his whole army to pursue Nero, who had set out with only 6,000 armed men, or else to attack the camp, abandon the plunder without proper forces, without its high command, without its auspices. The earlier disasters in that war, the death of 2 consuls in the preceding year, were still terrifying, and they said that all those misfortunes had befallen them when the enemy had but a single general, a single army in Italy. At present, it had become 2 Punic Wars, 2 mighty armies, 2 Hannibals, so to speak, in Italy. For Hasdrubal was also a son of the same father, Hamilcar, and an equally strenuous commander, trained for so many years in Spain by a war with the Romans. Him is too for a double victory in the destruction of 2 armies, and generals of great distinction, certainly of the swiftness of his march from Spain, and of having aroused the Gallic tribes to war, he could boast more than Hannibal himself, for he had gathered an army in the very region in which Hannibal had lost the larger part of his forces by hunger and cold, the most pitiable forms of death. Furthermore, men acquainted with events in Spain repeatedly added that he would encounter in Gaius Nero no unknown general, but one whom he, when he himself surprised, as it happened in a difficult pass, had balked and baffled like a child by the pretense of drawing up terms of peace. They reckoned all the enemy forces even larger than their own, less than they were, since fear is an interpreter always inclined to the worst side. And it's opinions like this, I think, that feed Cressy's argument in the 15 decisive battles of the world that Metaurus is one of those battles. So if we look at the situation, Hasdrubal sends messengers to Hannibal to indicate that he wants to conjoin their forces somewhere in Umbria. Cressy points out that the mistake he made was that the actual plans were in the hands of these messengers. He argues that the plans that they had should have been fake and the real plans committed to memory. But nonetheless, they were captured by the forces of Nero. So Nero has a dilemma here. On the one hand, the Roman consuls are not allowed to take independent initiative and leave their theater of command if the Senate hasn't confirmed it yet. But seeing the time was of the essence, and that a juncture of Hannibal and Hasdrubal would likely mean the end of the war in Italy, at least that was his fear, and the fear of many in Rome, he sent messengers to Rome explaining his actions. So basically, it's easier to ask for forgiveness and permission. And in the case of Nero, it seems that fortune favors the bold, and if you win, then that does work out. So he did an incredible forced march with 7,000 men, 6,000 foot, 1,000 horse, covering 250 miles in 7 days. He also was reinforced by volunteers along the way in order to help defeat Hasdrubal. And of course, Hasdrubal himself made the fatal error of delaying the besiege around Placentia. And so finally, he joins up with Marcus Livius's forces, who are, of course, shadowing Hasdrubal. He reaches that army at night, so it kind of covers his march. But Hasdrubal, that evening and then the day after, hears an extra trumpet being blown, indicating that new troops have come. So he decides to withdraw from the engagement. And at this side, both sides have around 40,000 men. And so Hasdrubal uses his Gaelic guides to march to a new position. Now, his second mistake is, the second mistake was the messengers. The third mistake is giving battle at all. He should have marched around to get to Hannibal. So this area is Arminium, which Hannibal bypassed completely by marching over the Apennine Mountains into the Arno Swamp. So there is a way that Hasdrubal could have marched around. It might have lost, 5,000, 6,000 men, but Hannibal didn't care. And if they could have joined up with Hannibal, it wouldn't have mattered. But the Gaelic guides that he had betrayed him and led him around to wander around and get confused and lost. And finally, that next day, he was attacked by the combined Roman forces. And at the lining up of the force, Hasdrubal had his Iberians, Ligurians, Gaelic, and African foot arrayed along the Metaurus River. So on his right, he deployed his cavalry and his elite Spanish troops. In the center, he had the Ligurians with elephants in front, and on his left, he had the Gaelic warriors. Now, the left flank was anchored by rough terrain and hills, and the right flank was anchored by the river. Now, on the Roman side, we had the left was commanded by Marcus Livius, the right was commanded by Gaius Claudius, and the center by Licinius. So when the battle begins, the center and the Carthaginian right are inconclusive. The elephants cause trouble to both sides. The elite Spanish Iberians and their cavalry are able to contain the Romans. Nero on the Roman right tries to attack the Gaelic forces, which, because of the difficulty of the terrain crossing, makes it difficult for him to achieve a decisive engagement. Seeing that this terrain would be equally difficult for the Gauls to cross, leaves half of his command to contain the Gaelic forces and does a rapid force march to the Roman left and delivers a knockout blow to Hasdrubal's forces on that particular flank, where his cavalry and Iberian troops are smashed. And then the Roman left pivots and then rolls up the center. When Hasdrubal realizes the battle's lost, he charges into the midst of the Roman forces with his Iberian survivors in order to die in battle rather than be captured and humiliated. And then the Gaelic forces are completely surrounded and destroyed. And at this point, the Romans and eventually Hannibal, when he realizes of his brother's death, realizes the war in Italy is basically over. After Hannibal was delivered the head of his brother, according to Livy, he basically realized the war in Italy was over and retired to Bruttium for the rest of the war until he was recalled to Africa. So at this point, the war in Italy is effectively over, and the Romans can now begin to free up troops for a broader attack on Africa proper. So your thoughts on that?
Right. Yeah, this is exactly correct in the sense that, this is the end of offensive initiative for the Carthaginians in Italy. And of course, there's nothing, Hannibal doesn't have the strength, a strong enough army to trick, at this point, the Romans have learned a lot from Hannibal in the sense that they're not tricked into a pitched battle with Hannibal, because he's obviously the more superior commander and he makes better use of the terrain in Italy, as well as he's been able to lean on his allies at the right time. However, sometimes, oftentimes that it was that Hannibal found that there were too many allies to support or protect simultaneously, and he didn't have enough men to make this happen. So unfortunately, for Hannibal, it's hard for him to garner enough local support from these newly Roman defectors, and also they lack the sort of quality that many of the that the Spaniards or Ligurians or Iberians had under Hannibal. Some of these Gaelic tribes, they were unpredictable, and they often backstabbed and betrayed the Carthaginians in other cases, like in Iberia. So they were difficult to work with. And so, as you say, Hannibal spends the winter in Bruttium and will eventually be called back to Africa for what he assumed, I'm sure he rightfully assumed, would be the invasion of Carthaginian territory in modern-day Tunisia.
And what's interesting, too, is if we look at Metaurus and Hasdrubal, the majority of commentators, even those that would otherwise be hostile to Carthage, think of like, Polybius is somewhat sympathetic to Carthage, but even like Livy or later on the English historian Cressy, all seem to agree that Hasdrubal just kind of got unlucky in the sense that he did mostly what any competent commander would have been expected to do. But when you're dealing with treacherous Gaelic allies who lead you on, fool's errands, it's sort of like, well, what do you do, right? Or that your messengers get captured. I mean, these are just those tough breaks that happen in war. I'm reminded of this, Ecclesiastes 9:11. The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the men of understanding, nor favor to the men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. Some of these things Hasdrubal just couldn't reasonably have expected to happen. And of course, the man of the hour here is Nero. He does a forced march over essentially a fortnight up to Metaurus and then back. And Hannibal doesn't even know what happened. I mean, this is literally a coup for the Romans at a level that you really haven't seen yet in the war. Because if Hannibal had been aroused to do anything, to march anywhere, it could have thrown the whole Roman scheme into confusion and could have given Hasdrubal the win that he needed. And I think what's interesting here is what is the decisive battle of the war? Because obviously Cressy has developed a school of thought and interpretation that is Metaurus. And certainly Polybius and Livy believed that a juncture of Hasdrubal and Hannibal would have been catastrophic for the Romans. But also, I'm of the opinion that it was Battle of Ilipa, where Scipio finally broke the back of Carthaginian power in Spain. No more Celtiberians as soldiers, and no more gold and silver to pay mercenaries, without which the Carthaginians couldn't have won. So even if we assume a Carthaginian victory at Metaurus, and Hannibal and Hasdrubal unite, leading an army of 70,000 men together, arguably any Roman army in the field would have been annihilated, admittedly. But since the Romans had already been pursuing a Fabian strategy for years now, they wouldn't have risked a Cannae-style battle. They would have known better. And would they have still been able to wear out Hannibal with a Fabian strategy? Because even though Marcellus was dead, because he was aggressive and impulsive, Fabius was still alive. And we saw that his more subtle and slow and efficient method achieved success with the capture of Tarentum. So it would have been bad. It would have been very bad if they had linked up. But I don't know I think it was too late in the war. I think too many Carthaginians had died. The fate of Spain was already lost. I just don't know how decisive it was. But what I can say is after both Metaurus and Ilipa, there was no chance Carthage had of winning the war. All that was left was the cruel mathematics of attrition.
Right. Yeah, there is a debate among contemporary historians about what was, the decisive turning point. I mean, in a similar way that the Battle of Midway was the turning point for the United States and the Pacific. Well, it's difficult to locate because, of course, you have two campaigns going on simultaneously. But I think I agree with you in the sense that, after the loss at Ilipa was, after that had occurred, well, if there's no more money to pay mercenaries, how is Carthage going to field an army? Because the ways in which Rome and Carthage went about raising armies was entirely different. Carthage had relied on its, this merchant class to raise money, from these various, from naval mercantilism and from its vast trade network that it more or less it inherited from its Phoenician ancestors, whereas Rome had a very robust and organized political and social system where you weren't just merely subjects of the Roman system, although anecdotally, in places like Capua, if you ended up betraying the Romans, your population might end up getting massacred. However, typically Romans, as long as you paid into the Roman system, you could still maintain your religion and your culture. You just had to be part of the Roman Empire. And part of that was, compulsory conscription to their armies. So there were two various, methodologies going on here. And the Roman logistics and the method of raising armies was just simply more consistent and more reliable. And so, with the head being cut off the snake, so to speak, financially from the Carthaginians, it was only, unfortunately, a matter of time before Carthage could no longer pay its mercenary forces, and Rome now has the might of something of, 20 to even 25 legions by the time the Third Punic War has started. So, I think while I would say that the Battle of Metaurus was decisive for no further offensive operations on the part of Carthaginians, I think Aleppo was really the end of things in general.
Well, exactly. And I think what these 5 years are also show us is, one, again, the fact that Rome had naval superiority allowed them to do what Carthage couldn't. So Rome, with the right leadership under, say, a Scipio, could strike at the power base of Carthage directly. New Carthage, for example. The Carthaginians could not attack the Roman power base directly. It also benefited that the Roman power base was diffuse amongst all of its allies. There wasn't just one thing to attack. I mean, there was the city of Rome, but that was too well defended to attack. Whereas the Carthaginians had not taken proper precautions to defend New Carthage. They again relied on this is what I call the impassable terrain fallacy. There is no such thing as impassable terrain. Somebody will find a way to get through it, whether it's the lagoons of New Carthage, whether it's the mountainous passes around Mexico City, breached by Robert E. Lee as engineer for the American Army, or there was the Germans in the Ardennes in 1940. There's no such thing as impassable terrain. And it's a fallacy that, only complacent generals buy into. The Romans believed that with the Alps. So you think with its complacency, and especially Hannibal's end run with the Alps and later Hasdrubal's, the Carthaginians would have paid more concern to this, but they apparently didn't. And we see that Hasdrubal, unlike Hannibal, didn't have to squander his forces crossing the Alps. It still was a long, hard march that prevented him from striking Italy where he wanted to. He would have preferred to go straight to Hannibal, and the most direct course would have been by sea, but that was denied him by Roman naval power, in part secured at the Battle of Ebro in 217 BC. So we do see that there's these vast maneuver operations. So Hasdrubal does this vast end run through Gaul and northern Italy, just like his brother Hannibal had. He meets defeat at the Metaurus. Scipio does an end run by sea to New Carthage, and then outmaneuvers and outfights the more numerous Carthaginian commanders in Spain. One of the things that bedeviled the Carthaginians in Spain was lack of coordination. It wasn't so much that they were infighting. I mean, Mago and Hanno and Gisco sort of worked together, but it wasn't a unified command. It wasn't, or let me put it this way, they didn't actively harass each other, but they didn't actively cooperate either, which created problems. If the Carthaginian forces had all mustered immediately after New Carthage, we could have seen an army of 80 to 90,000 Carthaginians to besiege New Carthage, and which would have been more than enough to contain and hold Scipio, who only had at most 30,000. But they didn't do it. Part of the reason why they didn't do it, I think, is because of the unreliability of the Gauls, the Celtiberians. The beginning with Hamilcar himself, when he crossed into Spain in 237, is the idea that they ruled through force and terror. I mean, just like the Romans ruled through force and terror in Cisalpine Gaul. And, surprise, surprise, nobody likes being ruled with a big stick. And so the real question was, who would benefit the most from angry Gauls? And it turns out Rome did, because Rome was able to use them with Scipio to defeat the Carthaginians. And I think that was one of the reasons why they didn't they didn't consolidate their forces to fight Scipio. And it's also quite possible they didn't consolidate their forces because they were afraid of a repeat of the Upper Beatus battle, where Scipio tries to take the gold and silver mines. And so if they concentrated to fight Scipio in one place, he might march around another place to destroy the logistics hub. So this is a lot of it's speculation, but given the strategic play here, I think those are things that prevented them from unifying. But but the lack of unifying their forces was what lost them the conflict in Spain.
Yeah, I completely agree. The lack of coordination, as well as well, and other things. I mean, this might be a bit anecdotal to your general comment of the unreliability of the Celtiberians, but the Carthaginians had done things earlier, like they had kidnapped the children of various Celtic tribesmen, the leaders of some of these tribesmen, in order to keep them sort of loyal and in check. And perhaps that was at the time, in order to maintain a world power, maybe that was one of the only realistic options, because these tribes are just so unhinged and difficult to control or difficult to form an alliance with. However, things like that just typically don't bode well for political or military alliances. And another thing is that the political situation at home with Carthage, there was a lot of people that were committed to the war and a lot of people that were not, that were constantly trying to appeal for peace to the Romans, giving further ground to the Romans. However, Hannibal, had sort of made this vow early on in his life to, defeat the Romans in pitched battles and see Rome destroyed and burned, something like that, something very, biblical, if that's one way to put it. But unfortunately, the logistics, the coordination, and the bad, well, yeah, the alliance building for the Carthaginians was just not a winning strategy. It, what would have happened, what would have worked, is if Hasdrubal had managed to link up with Hannibal, and if there was, if there was any time to, form an assault on Rome, it would have been early on, before Rome could have, materialized these new legions just out of thin air like they had. Again, they lowered the age to 16, and they started forcibly conscripting slaves. They were throwing together anything they could at the last minute to create, more men for Hannibal to hack through, to, at the point where it'd just be too much. And that's what ended up happening. And so his one of Hannibal's cavalry commanders, I forget the name, but he famously said, "Hannibal, you know how to attain victory, but you typically don't know what to do with them." Yeah, maybe that's right, because perhaps if Hannibal had leaned on his allies much harder, then perhaps, or more forcefully leaned on his allies, and having a different political situation at home, or him being able to convince the Carthaginians in Carthage to assault Rome, but he needs the help of money and more men, well, then that could have changed history entirely. Because, Hannibal really was the best commander, between, just the best commander, period, in the entire war, because, he knew how to, he understood the Roman system. He understood Roman strategy. And so he knew how to bait them into pitched battles. He knew how to ambush them, even with really bad terrain. As you said earlier, there's no terrain is impassable. And he found a way to make it work. And so, yeah, but unfortunately, I, just have some closing comments here. Yeah, this is the end of Carthaginian, this is the end of the Carthaginian power base in southern Italy, and this is also the end of Carthaginian influence and also their gold and silver mines in southern Spain. And what we'll see after this is the campaign in Africa by Scipio Africanus, as well as just the broader Third Punic War in general. So I think I'll leave my closing comments at that.
I'll close with this. The decisive victory at Aleppo broke the back of Carthaginian power, stripped of her naval power and trade networks from the First Punic War, and now cut off from the Celtiberians and mineral wealth of Spain. Carthage's demise were ensured. Scipio had demonstrated mastery of tactics, operations, and strategy, as well as diplomacy in a single operation that has seldom been matched in history. Thanks again, Terminal Philosophy.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flood podcast, signing off.